There is a great myth that has been carried across generations, the idea that there exists a gap between you and the divine. We have been taught to see ourselves as separate, finite, bound by our bodies, our thoughts, and our egos. But the truth is, the gap is only an illusion, a misunderstanding of the nature of who you are. When you believe you are separate from the divine, when you perceive God as something distant or unreachable, that belief shapes your entire reality. This idea of a gap arises because we define ourselves by the limitations of our ego, a small individual I that cannot see beyond its own boundaries. Yet the divine is not something external, it is within you, flowing through you, all around you. The moment you let go of this illusion of separation, you start to realize that the gap you have been perceiving does not exist. Look around you. The divine is not confined to a place or a specific form. It is the very energy that runs through everything. The trees, the sky, the stars. All are manifestations of this vast, boundless force. If you search for God only in temples or books, you will miss the very essence of what God truly is. The gap disappears when you understand that God is not separate from you, but part of the same universal consciousness. It is within your very nature, in your deepest consciousness, that this connection exists. The key to realizing your oneness with the divine is not to go out and seek, but to go within. Through self-awareness, mindfulness, and deep meditation, you can awaken to this inherent connection. The gap between you and God is only as wide as the space you create in your mind. In our world, we are constantly told that God is far away, something we must work hard to reach. But that is a misunderstanding. God does not dwell in distant lands. The divine is here now, within you, all around you. When you see yourself as separate, you perpetuate the illusion of a gap. But when you recognize your true nature, when you shed the illusion of being apart from the source, the gap dissolves. This journey of realization is not about bridging a gap. It is about recognizing that there has never been any separation. It is about understanding that you have always been one with the divine and you will always be. The gap between you and God is not something to be solved. It is an invitation to discover the unity that has always existed. And when you do, you will realize there was never a gap, only the illusion of one. The divine is you and you are the divine. The idea of separation is a deeply ingrained belief that shapes much of our experience in life. From the moment we are born, we are taught to see ourselves as individuals, separate from the world around us. This perception of separation extends not only to other people, but also to the divine, to God. We are raised to believe that there is a gap between us and the divine, as if God resides somewhere far away, beyond our reach. This belief, however, is at the heart of much of human suffering and confusion. In reality, this separation is an illusion, a construct of the mind. We view ourselves as individuals with a clear boundary between me and you, us and them. But if we carefully observe, we see that the very nature of life is interconnected. Nothing exists in isolation. Every breath you take, every thought you think, every movement you make is part of a larger interconnected whole. We are all part of a web of existence, yet we persist in believing that we are distinct, separate entities, disconnected from everything else. This false perception of separation creates a sense of distance between us and God, a sense that the divine is something out there, something external to us. It is in this belief that we find the root of the gap we feel between ourselves and the divine. The mind, however, is a master at creating distinctions. It constantly categorizes, labels, and divides everything into separate parts. This is how we make sense of the world around us, but it also creates a duality, us versus them, self versus other, human versus divine. We take these categories so seriously that they become the lenses through which we view all of life. In doing so, we forget that everything, including ourselves, is part of a greater unified whole. The feeling of separation extends beyond just our relationship with others and the divine. It influences how we relate to the world itself. When we see ourselves as separate from nature, from animals, from the earth, we treat them as resources to be exploited, rather than as parts of a greater system. We fail to recognize the inherent sacredness in every living being, in every particle of life. When we see ourselves as apart from the divine, we engage in rituals, prayers, or practices that reinforce the idea of a distant God to whom we must offer devotion in hopes of receiving grace. We imagine that God is something that must be appeased, a powerful figure on a distant throne. But in truth, the divine does not reside somewhere far away outside of ourselves. It is not something that can be reached through external effort, nor is it a force that sits separate from creation. The divine is the very essence of existence itself, woven into every fabric of life. It is within the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the ground you walk upon. It is the heartbeat of the universe, the energy that flows through everything. The perception that the divine is far away, separate from us, comes from the mind's tendency to divide and categorize, to create a distance where none truly exists. As long as we cling to the illusion of separation, we will continue to experience the divine as something distant, something we must search for. We will feel a sense of longing, a sense of incompleteness. But the moment we begin to see beyond this illusion, when we look past the labels, the boundaries, the divisions, we can begin to recognize the unity that connects us all. The divine is not something apart from us, it is within us. It is the source of our very being, the essence of who we truly are. When we drop the concept of separation, we begin to see that we are not individual, isolated beings, but expressions of the same divine energy. There is no gap between us and God. The gap is merely a figment of our imagination, perpetuated by the mind's need to create divisions. As we begin to let go of the illusion of separation, we experience the profound realization that we are not separate from the divine, but a reflection of it. The true path to understanding the divine is not one of striving to bridge a gap, but rather one of realizing that the gap was never there to begin with. The divine is not outside of us, it is within us, always present, waiting to be recognized. When you dissolve the boundaries that the mind has constructed, you open yourself to the infinite connection that exists in every moment. The separation you once perceived fades away, and all that remains is the recognition that you and the divine are one and the same. The ego plays a fundamental role in shaping our perception of the world, and much of the experience of separation between ourselves and the divine is rooted in the ego's influence. It is the ego that defines me as distinct and separate from you and from everything else in the universe. The ego is the part of us that identifies with our body, our thoughts, our accomplishments, our possessions, and even our beliefs. It draws lines around what it perceives as self and constructs an identity based on these boundaries. But this identification with the ego is the very source of the illusion of separation that we experience, especially in our relationship with the divine. The ego thrives on distinction and duality. It defines everything in terms of opposites. This versus that, inside versus outside, you versus me, human versus divine. This constant division creates a sense of fragmentation within our minds. Instead of recognizing the unity that underlies all things, the ego focuses on what makes each individual, each object, and each experience unique and separate. Through this lens, the divine becomes something other, something external, distant, and removed from us. The ego cannot fathom that the divine exists within and as part of us because it is conditioned to see everything in terms of self and other. This identification with the ego leads us to experience ourselves as individual, finite beings, apart from the vast, infinite universe and the divine presence that flows through it. The ego wants to protect this sense of separateness because it derives its sense of identity from it. When we are attached to our ego, we see ourselves as distinct from everything else, including the divine. We might even begin to feel that we must earn or deserve a connection with the divine, as if it is something outside of us that we must gain access to. This is a natural consequence of the ego's narrow view of existence, which is based on division and separation. Another aspect of the ego is its need for control. It desires to exert influence over life, to impose its will on the world. This desire for control further strengthens the sense of separation. The ego believes that it must manipulate and shape the world around it in order to feel secure, validated, and significant. It seeks external achievements, accolades, and possessions, thinking that these will somehow fill the emptiness it feels inside. But no matter how much the ego accumulates, it can never truly satisfy the deep longing for oneness with the divine, because the ego's very nature is built on separation. The ego is also the source of fear. Fear arises from the ego's awareness of its own limitations and fragility. The ego fears loss, rejection, failure, and ultimately death. These fears perpetuate the illusion of separation as the ego constantly seeks to protect itself from perceived threats. This fear-based mindset creates a barrier between us and the divine, because we begin to view the divine as something to be feared, or something beyond our ability to connect with. The ego clings to its own sense of identity and resists the idea of surrendering to a higher power because it believes that surrendering would mean losing control, losing itself. In truth, the ego is not the true self. It is a transient construct, built from past experiences, societal conditioning, and personal desires. It is not the essence of who we are. The ego's role is to help us navigate the world of form, but it becomes problematic when it convinces us that it is who we are at the core. The ego is a mask, an illusion that hides our true nature, which is interconnected with all life and with the divine. To transcend the ego is to recognize that we are not separate from the divine, but an expression of it. The divine is not something external to us. It is the very essence of who we are. When we let go of the ego's attachments and identification with the separate self, we can experience the profound realization that we are not individuals striving to reach God, but a manifestation of the divine itself. The process of transcending the ego is not about annihilating it or rejecting it. The ego has its place in our lives. It is essential for functioning in the material world. However, when we see the ego for what it is, a tool, not the source of our identity, we can begin to dissolve the boundaries it creates between us and the divine. Through practices such as meditation, self-inquiry, and mindfulness, we begin to loosen the grip the ego has on our perception, and in doing so, we allow the deeper connection to the divine to emerge. Ultimately, the ego's role in the perception of separation is to maintain the illusion of individuality. But the truth is that we are never separate from the divine. When the ego falls away, we come to recognize that we are not distinct from God, but an embodiment of the divine essence itself. Consciousness is the very essence of who we are. It is the awareness that allows us to perceive the world, the thoughts that arise in our minds, and the emotions that shape our experiences. However, much of the time we are unaware of the true nature of consciousness, often mistaking it for the fleeting thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that come and go. This limited understanding of consciousness creates a sense of separation as we begin to identify with our individual thoughts and experiences, believing that we are distinct and separate from the world around us. In truth, consciousness is not confined to our individual experience. It is the fundamental connection between all beings and the entire universe. Our minds are constantly active, churning through thoughts, memories, and judgments. The ego, which is driven by the need for identity and separation, identifies these thoughts as my thoughts, creating a sense of individuality and distinction. When we think in these terms, we often forget that our thoughts are simply part of a larger stream of consciousness, one that is not limited to our personal experiences. The essence of who we are is not the thoughts themselves, but the awareness behind them, the pure consciousness that enables us to witness our thoughts without becoming attached to them. This consciousness is not bound by time, space, or form. It is universal. When we begin to recognize the nature of consciousness, we realize that it is not just personal awareness, but a shared field of intelligence that permeates all of life. The air we breathe, the earth beneath our feet, the sky above, and every living being around us. All of these are expressions of this same universal consciousness. We are not isolated beings experiencing the world alone. Rather, we are an integral part of the consciousness that flows through everything. The idea of separation, of being distinct from the world or from the divine, arises only when we identify too strongly with the surface level of consciousness, our thoughts, our individual experiences, our ego. The key to understanding our connection to the divine lies in recognizing that the consciousness we experience is not personal but universal. We are not separate from the source of creation. We are manifestations of it. Just as a wave is not separate from the ocean but an expression of it, so too are we expressions of the infinite consciousness that underlies all things. When we begin to perceive this deeper level of connection, the illusion of separation begins to dissolve. We realize that the gap we once felt between ourselves and God is nothing more than a mental construct, the product of the ego's tendency to divide and categorize. This realization does not require a leap into the unknown, it simply requires a shift in perception. When we quiet the mind and move beyond the surface layer of individual thoughts, we open ourselves to a deeper, more profound awareness of the world around us. This awareness is not fragmented but whole. It is not personal but universal. As we come into alignment with this greater consciousness, we begin to feel a deep sense of connection with all beings, with nature, with the divine. It is through this connection that we begin to experience life in its truest form, not as isolated individuals but as part of a vast, interconnected web of existence. The practices that help us awaken to this connection are those that draw our attention inward to the pure consciousness that resides within us. Meditation, mindfulness, and self-inquiry are powerful tools for this. These practices allow us to step beyond the confines of the mind and into the awareness that is the foundation of all experience. As we spend more time in this awareness, we begin to see that everything, every thought, every feeling, every experience is an expression of the same universal consciousness. The illusion of separation fades, and we come to see that we are not separate from the divine, but an embodiment of it. This shift in perception does not mean that we cease to experience individuality, but rather that we understand our individuality as part of the larger whole. We begin to see that our thoughts, emotions, and actions are not isolated events, but expressions of the same consciousness that flows through all of creation. This understanding brings a sense of peace, for we no longer feel the need to grasp at fleeting experiences or identity. Instead, we recognize that everything is part of the same divine intelligence, and we are an integral part of it. In this way, consciousness and connection are two sides of the same coin. When we recognize the true nature of consciousness, we come into direct experience of a deep connection to everything around us. This awareness transcends the illusion of separation, and we are left with a profound sense of unity with the divine, with nature, and with all beings. The gap we once believed existed between ourselves and the divine disappears, and in its place we experience the oneness that has always been present. This is the true nature of connection, to realize that we are not separate but part of a greater divine whole.